Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Alvaro Huerta, and I'm an assistant professor here at Cal Poly Pomona, the great university. I'm an assistant professor in urban and regional planning, in ethnic and women's studies. So I want to welcome everybody to this fantastic symposium. Just looking at the mangoes makes me hungry. And I'm very excited that everybody is here to join us. I must say, anytime I speak around the country and around the world, I always brag about Cal Poly students. I feel that Cal Poly students are the best students in the universe. You are very diverse. You are very open-minded. And not only are you interested in helping yourselves, but you're also interested in helping your families and your communities. Throughout the country, we see a lot of racism on campuses. A lot of hatred, a lot of xenophobia. And since I've been here, I haven't seen that once. And that says a lot about Cal Poly. It says a lot about our diversity, our values. And this is why it makes me proud to be here today. And I'm very hopeful for future generations, because of your generation has done a fantastic job in working with each other and looking past our differences and focusing on our commonalities. So today we're here to speak about an important issue that is impacting Los Angeles and the country and actually the world, the case of street vending. This is something that is not unique to Los Angeles or New York. If you go anywhere in the world, Guatemala City, Mexico City, Accra, Ghana, anywhere in the world, there's street vending. And we're here to touch a little bit about the case of street vending in Los Angeles. And we'll have a few speakers and presenters that we'll introduce as the program goes along. And then we'll have a few Q&A to do that. So I'm going to start with introducing our chair of the department, Dr. Rick Wilson, who will provide some welcoming comments to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Alvaro. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to see you here. I see there's some notes in front of me. Am I supposed to read these? Okay. Maybe I'll read them in French Canadian. I don't know. So welcome again. We're delighted that Alvaro is bringing this issue to the College of Environmental Design and Department of Urban and Regional Planning. For those of you in the crowd who are planners, you know that part of the job of planning is to provide economic ladders for people, to make a livelihood, to create economic activity in communities. And so this issue is very relevant to that. But also, planners are involved in regulating the development of built form and the use of space. And so planners need to be aware of the appropriate role of street vending in cities and not inadvertently prevent it or make it difficult and take away that economic ladder. And at the same time, we have to work with the brick and mortar merchants and the city council and everyone else. So our work is very much related to how street vending is supported and how it's regulated in cities. So this is an excellent issue for us planners to address. Those of you who aren't planners, welcome to the College of Environmental Design. We're glad you're engaging in this conversation with us. This effort is part of our department's effort to increase the amount of attention we give to community development, which includes economic development, affordable housing, making communities safe and work better. So we're delighted that this is an event that marks our greater emphasis on community development. So thanks very much for coming, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So this is Dr. Wilson's last year as chair, so a round of applause for all his work. A little bit louder because I need a raise. Also, we want to present one of our co-sponsors, Jesus Navidad from APSA.
Thank you, Dr. Huerta. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome again to the Street Vending Symposium. I just want to say thank you to the Urban Planning Department and thank you to our speakers for being here today. We think that this is a very important issue that needs to be discussed especially in our planning dialogue here at our campus. And I just want to say thank you also to the Graduate Planning Student Association for helping us co-sponsor the event. Thank you very much. Enjoy.
So our last speaker to provide some welcoming comments is David Mock or Karen Varela. They work hand in hand.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Karen Varela, not David Mack. And I just wanted to welcome you guys. Thank you for coming to the symposium. And that's it.
So we'll start with the program now. We're going to have two PowerPoint presentations and then a Q&A with an individual that works as a street vendor, so entrepreneur from Mexico, my mother's father's home country. So with the presentation and the PowerPoint, I'm going to go a little bit quickly because of time, but if people want a copy of it, you could just email me. And as somebody who works at the informal economy, I can sell copies in the parking lot after, so just let me know. Cash, please. So I just want to put some context to this issue of street vending and looking at within the context of the informal economy. Just spend a few minutes and just give a little background information. So the first question is, what is the informal economy? We hear a lot about, this issue. In the news, in movies and in books and so on and so forth, but not that many people provide a good definition. And in reality, there's not really one good definition, but the best I can come up with is by an excellent book, an edited volume by Castells and Portes in 1989, that they compiled several scholars looking at the United States and cases of informality among Mexican immigrants, African Americans, and other ethnic minorities within the context of the United States, where they argue that the informal economy is something that is vital and is present here in the United States and not just in underdeveloped countries. So in short, when we're thinking about the informal economy, we're looking economic activity that's unregulated by the state. So that would be the key definition, that the state, it's economic activity that's outside of the purviews of the state. And so this is something that we'll talk about in the case of street vending, today. So in 1971, there was a scholar working in Africa. He wrote a paper, first gave a presentation on this issue of the informal sector, a term that he coined. So Dr. Keith Hart focused on the case of Accra, Ghana. He saw that street vending, not necessarily street vending itself, but the informal economy was a major part of the economy. Because before his studies and before the case of Ghana, street vending and other forms of informal economy activity throughout Latin America and Africa was seen as marginal. It was seen as something that few individuals did because they were desperate to survive. And he argued, no, this is an integral part of the economy. I mean, literally, more than 1/3 of the economy in Accra, Ghana at the time is part of the informal economy. And it's organized and it's sophisticated. When we talk about marginal people, we're talking about isolated individuals that do not behave in conjunction with others. The case of street vendors, the case of any form of informal economy like gardeners, domestic workers, they're not individuals that operate in isolation or by themselves. They operate through their networks. They operate in association with other ethnic communities, among themselves and even within the formal economy. So this is something that is important, an important work that was developed by Dr. Hart in framing the informal economy as something that's relevant, something that's worthy of study, and it's something that is important, to all economies in the world. So there's a lot of different interpretations of the informal economy, and it's something that it creates confusion. So there's fuzzy, a term that is used in terms of looking at, what is the informal economy. So we have the irregular economy, invisible sector, the hidden sector, unregulated, underground, shadow economy, off the books. But you also see in the United States in particular, there's a little bit of racism involved, where a lot of times when we talk about the informal economy, is the dark economy, is the black economy, the black market, right? And when you think about the black market, the dark economy, what comes to mind? We think about African Americans in the youth, in the inner city, and Latinos, behaving in a way outside of the law. So there are many characteristics about the informal economy that I think it's important that we understand, not just as students, but as future leaders. And as we have some attorneys here, some representatives of the county. We also have people that engage in informal economy. Maybe some of your parents, like my mother, she was a domestic worker. My father worked for a short period as a day laborer, have relationships with people in the informal economy. So it's important to understand some of the characteristics. So one of the characteristics is the easy entry. So anybody that comes from this country, from any part of the world, it doesn't really matter. It could be from Guatemala, it could be from India, it could be from China. And if they don't have access to the formal economy, it's easy to just start to work in the informal economy because you're not asked for an application, you're not asked for ID, you're not asked for Social Security or anything of that nature. So it's easy entry, not just for individuals, but also corporations. And also these individuals, whether they're individuals or corporations, they don't report typically to the state, their income. Or if they do, they underreport. And it's basically what we're looking at here is the cash economy. Like the clicker, cash economy. Also with these enterprises, many of them are family owned and operated. So you see with street vendors, even the case of our guest speaker, his son also helps him, with this enterprise. A lot of times when you have domestic workers, for example, is the mother and the daughter helping. Or where you have gardeners, for example, a case that I study also, you have the brother, you have the uncle, you have the padrino, everybody in the family, helping in. So the family is important to these enterprises. There are a lot of them, or the majority of them are small scale as well. So they're primarily low skill, but not all. But there is also a lack of employment security. So this is very a precarious sector. We don't see a union representation. There's also a lack of work benefits that we take advantage and protections that some of us take advantage of in terms of the formal economy. For example, there's no Social Security benefits. There's no overtime. We don't have workers' compensation. If somebody gets injured, they're not protected by the law. This idea of 40-week weeks, minimum wage, this issue was argued and fought by Jewish immigrants in the United States in the 1850s, fighting in the United States for the right to have 40-hour weeks and minimum wage. Because of their efforts and other organizers and anarchists and social-minded people, we have 40-hour weeks here in the United States in the formal economy that we take for granted. But for immigrants, for people that work in the informal economy, they don't have this. They don't have this luxury. So they work pretty much around the clock. There's no health insurance, no child labor protections. The only reason I went to UCLA in 1985 as a freshman was because my father took me to work as a day laborer when I was 13 years old. He actually exploited me. I need to ask for some back wages there. At 13-year-old working as a day laborer. But he took me to teach me the value of hard work. And as a lazy U.S. citizen kid, I realized after working 4 hours in the sun that the university is for lazy people. So it's easier to go to the university than to work as a gardener 12 hours a day in the sun. So we see a lot of these individuals have their children employed as gardeners, as helping them in their industry, and whatever activity that they engage in the informal economy, but they don't see it as child exploitation because in their countries, when they were young, they entered the labor market at 10 years old, at 12 years old, at 15. If you don't believe me, ask your parents, ask your grandparents, ask people, what did they do? When did they first start working? We see also there's a violation of zoning rules and codes. There's sweatshops, for example, that operate in Los Angeles. Los Angeles and New York operate two of the major sweatshops in the United States. And a lot of it is high fashion. So when you watch the Oscars or any of the Emmys and all these different programs, all these fancy people, a lot of the clothes that they wear were made in Los Angeles in sweatshop labor. So there's also disregard for occupational health and safety. But it's not limited to the informal economy, to the underdeveloped countries. We see this as a rise in the United States in terms of the informal economy here in the United States. So there's a lot of myths. It's not just immigrant workforce or crime-ridden. It's not restricted to poor people. Speaking of the economy, what about offshore tax havens for the wealthy, like in the Pomona Papers, right? So how many corporations and rich people in the United States don't pay taxes, right? So they too underreport or not report. But also we see that there's a myth that it's only about workers. That's not true. In the informal economy, all of the street vendors, they're entrepreneurs. They don't work for anybody, they work for themselves. And they have that drive, the drive that Americans have lost. The work ethic that Americans talk about but they don't practice. It's the immigrant that brings that strong work ethic. And this is what America should learn from their past, learn from their present instead of scapegoating them. So I'll just touch a few more before we go to our next presenter due to the lack of time. So we need to differentiate about licit and illicit. Right now with the police, when they do enforcement on street vendors, they treat the street vendor, the person selling food, the same as they would someone selling drugs. Right? Somebody selling mangoes and somebody selling crack cocaine, the police treat them the same. They're both fined, they're cited, the goods are confiscated, and so on and so forth. So there's no differentiation. So what's important about the informal economy, we need to differentiate between licit activity, even though it's unregulated or unlawful. We're talking about street vendors, taco trucks, gardeners, and even mechanics or people who prepare taxes. What about the people that charge $150 to prep kids to go to the university, right? So all of this is unregulated, but it's licit. And it should be treated differently than drugs, firearms, ammunition, and things of that nature. There's some questions regarding DVDs and CDs and all that, but all my DVDs are, well, I can't say that. Strike that from the record. So these are just some statistics about Los Angeles and the county of how many people are vending, what's the percentage, and it's pretty large. We also see the sectors here, private households, construction, arts, restaurant, food, landscaping, auto repair. It's pretty comprehensive. So the researchers and the Economic Roundtable in Los Angeles, they found on average that each person that engages in economic activity in the informal economy makes about $12,000 a year. At the county level, if we add up all those wages, we're looking at $8.1 billion. So there is a lot of economic activity taking place in Los Angeles County. Okay, we'll end with that, and we're going to have our next speaker. This is when you're supposed to applaud. We need to do it like in Jimmy Fallon, where they have the applause. You know? So our next speaker, and I'm happy that we have such an esteemed panel, a good-looking panel, if you ask me. But please don't just judge me for my looks. I don't like to be objectified. It's an issue I've been dealing all my life. Just please help me. So Doug Smith is an attorney. Works at public counsel, public interest attorney. He received his bachelor's from the University of Oregon, and he received his master's and JD from UCLA. So they have this joint program where you complete 2 degrees in, I think, 4 or 5 years. What is it? In 4 years. But he did it in 2 years because he's gifted. So Doug Smith is going to talk to us about the legal aspects of street vending and the case of the organizing efforts around this issue.
Thank you very much, Professor Huerta, for that. Perfect. How's this? Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the excellent overview. Again, my name's Doug Smith. I am an attorney at Public Counsel. Public Counsel is a nonprofit public interest law firm in Los Angeles, and I'm part of what's called the Community Development Project, and that's a team of attorneys that work with community-based organizations to enhance the capacity of nonprofit organizations, social service providers, and also enhance affordable housing, equitable development, and economic justice. And in that capacity, so I also, as Dr. Huerta noted, have a background in urban planning, and I'm able to work, fortunately, I love my work, I'm able to work at the intersection of law and planning and organizing. And in that capacity, I've been able to, for the last couple of years, work with and provide legal and policy support to the LA Street Vendor Campaign. Let's see if this works. Oops. Great. So first, I'm going to give a little bit of context about vending in LA, although you just heard an excellent overview. As Professor Huerta noted, it's ubiquitous. It's a fundamental part of the fabric of so many of our neighborhoods and our communities in Los Angeles and the city. It's estimated that there's about upwards of 50,000 vendors working in the city of Los Angeles. These are folks who are selling food and selling merchandise. I think food vendors get a lot of attention, but in fact, according to these estimates, the majority of vendors are selling non-food merchandise items. When we're talking about street vendors in this context, we're not talking about loncheros or the fancy food trucks. We're talking about the smaller scale operations, folks who are selling on sidewalks and in city parks. And again, this is an informal sector, and vendors are working to provide for their families. They're working out of economic necessity. Wages are very low, incomes are low. A lot of vendors, vending may be their sole source of income. For others, vending may augment other sources. But in many cases, these are low-income, often recent immigrants who have been shut out of the formal economy, other opportunities in the formal economy. And this is a way to provide for their families and build a business through entrepreneurship in a way that, as was noted, is not illicit, but is actually contributing significantly to our society, to our communities. And so I really want to emphasize that point. There's an economic lifeline element to this. There's an economic necessity, but it's so much more. It's such an important part of the fabric of our neighborhoods, of our communities. Vendors activate the public space. They provide eyes on the street, enhancing safety. They draw customers into commercial corridors, and in that way benefit brick and mortar businesses, attracting and activating commercial corridors. In many historically disinvested neighborhoods, vendors may be providing the only source of fresh or healthy food that's available in neighborhoods that don't have healthy food retail. Vendors often provide culturally significant, culturally important items, food items and otherwise, that traditional retail establishments aren't providing. And then, of course, vending is making significant, enormous economic contributions to the local economy. In addition to the stats that we saw before, the Economic Roundtable report estimated that vendors contribute up to $500 million to the local economy each year. So vendors buy local, they purchase from local suppliers, they facilitate capital recirculating in neighborhoods, and really, in so many ways, enhance the cultural vibrancy of our neighborhoods, but also the economic health. So vending is so important, so significant, and such an important aspect of our economy, and yet it is completely illegal in the city of Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Municipal Code prohibits vending on sidewalks and in city parks. There's a small exception for something called First Amendment vending, which is allowing vendors to sell expressive items that are protected by First Amendment freedom of speech, but it's a relatively narrow exception. And so for the most part, most vendors who are selling food and other items, that is prohibited under the municipal code. And in the last several decades, the city has made previous to now, one other attempt to sort of address this issue, and in the early 90s created or enacted an ordinance that would have allowed for the creation of very small vending districts, so really confined areas where a few vendors may be able to have the opportunity to get a permit, but would continue to completely criminally ban and prohibit vending in the rest of the city. And that program was enacted in the early 90s, but had so many barriers and so many sort of procedural loopholes and challenges for vendors that only one district was ever created in the MacArthur Park area, and that district quickly failed. And although this ordinance is technically still on the books, the city has abandoned it, and there is no infrastructure to implement or to allow for vending districts or vending programs. So as a result, the city of LA, there's a complete criminal ban on vending. If you are vending in the city of Los Angeles and you're cited, the penalties can be an infraction with a fine, technically a misdemeanor. You could be charged with a misdemeanor. And recently, the city has created something called an Administrative Citation Enforcement Program, or the ACE program. So it's a new administrative program that we're increasingly seeing being used in terms of to cite vendors for violation of these code sections. So what does this mean? What is the criminal ban? What does the criminalization of vending mean for the 50,000 vendors that are working in the city? So vendors can be arrested. Vendors are arrested. Citations carry significant fines, and then there's a base fine, and then often what happens is when they go through the court system, there will be additional court-imposed administrative fees that raise above the base fine, so that you're seeing really significant financial penalties for folks who, in many cases, are subsistence earners. We, unfortunately, are seeing an increase in the confiscation or the seizure of property and equipment when vendors are cited or have interactions with law enforcement. And for a vendor, as we'll hear, I think that the equipment, that's their livelihood. I mean, that's how they make their living. That's how they conduct their business. And so, in many cases, or in some cases, we're seeing the confiscation of that equipment without the adequate or requisite receipts or documentations that the vendor would need to go and retrieve that. This criminalization approach, I think, breeds intimidation, fear, distrust. In addition, especially, although rare, there are misdemeanors are possible, is a potential penalty for vending, and that carries significant consequences and implications for programs like DACA and DAPA and other immigration citizenship proceedings. And then, again, as we were hearing before, I mean, this criminalization approach creates a barrier to formalization. It prevents entrepreneurs from building their business, from climbing that economic ladder, and just reinforces sort of cycles of poverty and segregation of opportunity. So, because of this, because of these factors, and in response to these conditions, a few years ago, a coalition was formed. The LA Street Vendor Campaign came together to try to address some of these issues. The founding organizations included groups that had been working with street vendors for many, many years prior to this in different neighborhoods, including Boyle Heights and MacArthur Park, as well as some working groups that came out of the LA Food Policy Council who were focused on protecting the rights of food vendors. Since that time, the coalition has grown to over 60 organizations. And although core strategic decisions are made by what's called a steering committee, the coalition has membership from across the city and includes a really diverse group with different expertise, from labor to economic development to vendor organizing, law, and academia. But of course, at its core, the LA Street Vendor Campaign is a vendor-led, vendor-driven initiative, and so really prioritizes working closely with a core group of vendor leaders, and through vendor work group processes, building leadership, and taking sort of strategic direction from those that are most impacted, the vendors in the city of Los Angeles that are sort of coming together to drive this initiative forward. So I think it's probably very easy to think of this as just a legalization campaign, but it's really more. There's a really incredible approach, a comprehensive strategy to try to more broadly promote opportunities and protect the rights of street vendors. So obviously first and foremost, there's the systemic policy reform. There's the effort to those sections of the municipal code that prohibit vending and replace them with a program that would allow vendors to obtain permits to vend legally in the city of Los Angeles, consistent with a set of reasonable rules. But while that's going on, that process is happening slower than we would like. And so while we're working through the legislative process, vendors continue to be cited, continue to have suffer the impacts of criminalization. And so we really try to broaden legal support. Vendors need direct legal representation, and so thanks to some legal clinics by the National Lawyers Guild and UCLA Law School, we're able to expand services, legal support to vendors. Again, vendors being small businesses, we're really trying to, the coalition includes a number of organizations that are trying to think critically and creatively about how can we build out an infrastructure for technical assistance, how can we create lending programs that can allow vendors to access capital to overcome those initial costs, the entry costs that may come into play when there is a permit system. And then, of course, relying on building leadership development and relying on all of those different facets of a multi-pronged approach: earned media, social media, and messaging. So we're running short on time, so I'm just going to be really quick here, but I want to give a quick update on where we're at in the legislative process. So as a result of some significant organizing and mobilizing back in 2013, the campaign did a ton of outreach and really put pressure on the city to finally acknowledge this issue. And it's not a politically easy issue. I think a lot of politicians would rather not approach this because of the complications. But because of a lot of a really great organizing and pressure, in 2013, 2 council members introduced a motion that asked the city to look at and study the feasibility of a permit program that would allow for legalized vending. So this was great. I mean, this was a significant victory. It means the city is finally paying attention to this issue and is going to consider an approach. From there, the issue went to committees, and so it's been in the Economic Development Committee Council for a couple of years, and we've had a number of meetings where the committee has evaluated and looked at different models or different paradigms for legalized vending. And just recently at the last meeting, it shifted over to the Public Works Committee. And so we think there's going to be, most likely there will be a Public Works Committee meeting in June, in the next month or so. This is actually a really crucial moment for the campaign and for the strategy, or for legalization. I think at this meeting there's a good chance that council refines their approach and really looks at and identifies what the framework should be. Do they want to have a broad and inclusive and accessible program like our campaign is advocating for? On the other hand, there are those that want to try to prevent or exclude vending who are, I think, pushing for a much more limited district-based approach. And so it's possible at this meeting in June, the city is going to make that decision and they're going to identify the framework that they're going to move forward with. And so this, in many ways, after several years, the next couple months are absolutely crucial for the campaign. And so next steps include really working with council offices, building leadership, taking advantage of every opportunity that there is to lift up the voice and the perspective of vendors and inject into the process, and to make sure that the policy that's enacted is one that doesn't exclude but is rooted in inclusion, rooted in opportunity, is as comprehensive as possible, and is responsive to the core priorities that the vendor leaders have identified, things like not asking for citizenship or immigration status, and moving away from criminalization towards a compliance regime that's rooted in education and outreach. And so I would invite all of you to get involved. I brought some materials with me if you're interested in seeing. We went through a long process as a campaign and really creating vendor-driven policy framework. We went through a really participatory process. Vendors created a policy, a model policy. I'm happy to share that with you and answer any questions about it. But please go visit the website. We have a Facebook page. Check us out. I can stay as long as you guys are interested today to answer any questions. But also, please take down my contact information, if we can get it back up. And feel free to reach out with any questions and any interest in getting involved. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up with our last speaker. This is going to be like Barbara Walters, a Q&A here. So I'm going to ask him a few questions in Spanish, and he'll respond in Chinese. Just kidding. So just going to ask him a few questions, and then once the program is over, then we welcome people to stay and ask us questions after, given the time frame that we're working with. Okay, so you can follow me as I go sit down. Okay, so here I am, sitting down. So our next speaker or presenter here is Cerafine Zavala. He's been a street vendor for many years. And as I stated earlier, his son, Gabriel Zavala, is a proud alum of Cal Poly Pomona. So congratulations to him for that. So le voy a preguntar, ¿cuántos años tiene de vendedor? Acérquese ahí.
Como 25 años.
Pero se necesita que acercar.
Oh. Como 25 años de vendedor ambulante.
Okay, so I'll translate. 25 años de vendedor. No, I'm just kidding. 25 years. ¿Y qué son las luchas diario que uno como vendedor necesita? ¿Qué son una de las luchas las dificultades de su negocio? What are some of the difficulties of your business?
La lucha es de pararse temprano, ir a comprar la fruta y luego pues en las mañanas temprano tienes que preparar la pasta para hacer los chicharrones y para poder vender en la calle. No más que pues hay días que nos agarra la ciudad, nos quita todo, o luego no hay días que no nos dejan vender, pero pues nos los quitan y tenemos que comprar más para volver a trabajar, porque de eso vivimos. Y por eso pues Permiso, no dan. Dan, pero piden mucho requisito de dinero, pues que no lo puede uno tener.
Ok, para. Para traducir, ¿a qué hora se levanta?
A las 4 de la mañana.
Okay. So typically he gets up at 4 in the morning, and the struggle is working, having to prepare his products early in the morning, having to vend every single day, and then having the preoccupation of being cited by the police. So sometimes there's good days where he sells, but there's other days where he doesn't. But a lot of the struggle has to do with the daily grind of getting up early and having to be worried about being cited. So, ¿qué tipo de producto vende?
Pues vendemos chicharrones y papas fritas y mangos.
So he sells chicharrones, papas fritas, and mangos, as you can see. This is bilingual. Y como vendedor, ¿qué quiere de la ciudad? ¿Qué quiere que hagan para usted? Like, as a vendor, what do you want the city to do for you?
La ciudad le exige un carrito especialmente para eso, con agua caliente y agua fría. Y necesita uno de pagar renta en la comisaría para guardar el carrito. Y pues la verdad cobra muy caro, de 200 a 250. Y hay días que pues no se vende y ahí ellos no esperan que si vendes o no vendes, ellos tienen que agarrar su dinero a cada mes. Y es la diferencia del vendedor. Por eso a veces que uno pues no puede uno sacar permiso por lo mismo del negocio que no da para eso.
So one of the difficulties with the way the system works, if people are to go through the permits, you have to buy the product, you have to get a place to storage, you have to have hot water and cold water and things of that nature. And a lot of times you don't make enough money you actually lose. So those are some of the struggles. So para usted, cuando mira a la policía, ¿qué siente? When you see the police, what do you feel?
Pues hay policías que no le dicen uno nada, pero hay policías que pues de todo se ofenden. Si trabaja uno, se ofenden. Y si no trabaja uno, pues también se ofenden. Luego dicen que a la gente que anda trabajando le dan ticket porque ellos saben que sí pagan. Y la gente que no trabaja, pues ni les hacen caso. Andan robando, no los llevan ni a la cárcel porque los malos van a mantenerse, que no es necesario de agarrarlos a esos. Pero la gente que trabaja es donde ellos ponen ticket porque saben que uno lo va a pagar.
So with the police, a lot of times they don't tell you anything, they leave you alone. But the police see the workers that are selling, that are making money, and those are the ones that they go after because they know that those are the ones that are going to be able to pay the citation. Right? So this is an issue that those that are making money, that are doing something in terms of their activity, have to worry about. And we see that the police are not very consistent in the way they enforce the policy. So this is a preoccupation that people have. Y en términos de ¿hay competencia entre ustedes y cómo esa competencia le impacta a su negocio? So the question is there competition among vendors and how does that competition impact his sales?
Pues sí hay competencia porque hay gente que vende uno esto y la gente trata de vender lo mismo que uno. Y hay gente que dice, no, pues aquel vende bien, pero no es igual tener el modo y el carácter para tener el mismo negocio. Hay gente que sí tiene un don de vender y hay gente que pues no. Es la única diferencia, pues el que tiene más carácter es el que vende. Porque si van a comprarle a alguien y está con su modito, pues ni le dan ganas ni de comprar. Pero si lo recibe con cariño, no, pues bien amable, ok, hasta le dan uno propina. Esa es la cosa.
So los sangrones no venden.
Pues no, pues sí llegan a vender, pero no es igual. Le compran una vez y después ya no le vuelven a comprar.
So what he said was that there is competition and that a lot of times when vendors see other vendors that are successful, that are selling a lot, they copy them. They try to sell exactly the same thing. And also what he's saying is a lot of the successful vendors, you need to have personality, you need to have character, you need to be personable. And that's also a quality of being a good vendor, being successful. And those that don't have a good, that are not charismatic or that are not personable, have difficulties in selling their goods. Okay, so we have about 7 minutes. I'm going to open it up to a few questions. In the agenda, we said we're going to end at 1, so we're going to do that. So I would like to open it up for questions. Okay, going back to Oprah, here I am. So.
Hi, I have a question regarding like the legal issues that you were talking about. Like when, what happens with the vendors if they're not able to pay the fines, or do they stay in jail, or are they incarcerated, or what are the repercussions to that? Like, I would like to know.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So it depends on which program they're cited through. I remember there's the administrative citation program, and then there's the infractions. And unfortunately, what happens is if a vendor is fined, incarceration it happens, but it's really unlikely, or it's pretty uncommon. What is more common is a fine, and then if a vendor is unable to pay, then eventually that will go to collections, and there's a subpoena. And if the vendor then doesn't show up to court based on that, then there's what's called a failure to appear, which can be a misdemeanor. So it's difficult because vendors can be charged with misdemeanors for vending, and even if they're not charged with a misdemeanor for vending, that charge can ultimately rise to a misdemeanor for the failure to pay, failure to appear. So it's a challenge.
That's an excellent question. It's just to show how brilliant these students are. Okay, another question. I need to see one of my students ask a question because grades are coming around. Another question? Come on, people, not all at once. Okay, right here.
So you said, well, we know that the city of LA prohibits street vending, but you said that a small exception was for expressive items, right? So that I'm assuming that includes like the artists in downtown LA during the art walk, or things such as that. What constitutes expressive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what constitutes expressive items is a question that has baffled the city, has baffled the courts. There have been many lawsuits, in fact, revolving around that exact question. So the arts walk downtown, I don't know for sure. I think that may be sort of a sanctioned event with permits. But Venice Beach Boardwalk is an area where there have been lawsuits challenging this question, and vendors who felt like they were selling personal expressive items had been cited and challenged the citations that they were receiving, and have been successful in court. And so the city of Los Angeles has had to amend the language that provides that exception on numerous occasions based on lawsuits that have come out of that exact question. So it's an evolving definition, and one that's not entirely clear.
Okay, so we have one more question over here.
So you mentioned how the Legalized Street Vending campaign is pushing towards a citywide ordinance, but depending on the Public Works Committee, it could be like a sectioned off or just certain districts. What can be some of the impacts of it being a district ordinance versus a citywide?
That is a great question. So districts are problematic for a number of reasons. The fact is that vending occurs across the city, throughout the city. And so what we've seen when the city tried this before, when they created small districts, is you create an area where vending is allowed. If there's 50,000 vendors and you create an area that allows for maybe 50 vendors, then what's going to happen is you're going to have a number of vendors who want to buy into that, who want to play by these rules, and they're going to come to this area, or they're going to continue, and you don't have the ability. There's more of a demand to play by the rules than you have the ability to offer those incentives. And so really it perpetuates unregulated vending. It doesn't address the issue that the regulations are supposed to address, which is to create reasonable rules that allow vendors to build their business while also protecting the safety and accessibility of the sidewalks. And so if you don't have an opportunity for vendors to come into a system with rules that protect food safety, that protect accessibility, then what you're doing is enhancing the criminalization without creating adequate avenues for vendors to come into compliance and play by or adhere to the rules that have been set up based on health and safety.
Okay, who was the other question? Oh, okay, right here.
So how do big corporations fit into this dialogue? Are they active participants of the whole street vending issue that we have going on?
So I think that there's big corporations have not in a very visible way been participating. I think that it's been more of a dialogue between vendors and vendor advocates and sort of the smaller scale mom and pop brick and mortar businesses. And there's this narrative out there that brick and mortar businesses and vendors have to be there has to be a tension. And I think in our experience anyway, and with the vendors that we work with, that's a little bit overstated. In many instances, there isn't the direct competition that people fear that there is, and in a lot of cases, there's more of a symbiotic relationship. Vendors can activate that corridor, can bring additional foot traffic in that can benefit the small businesses. Some of those brick and mortar businesses may be interested in expanding onto the sidewalks and building their business out, and I think vending provides eyes on the street and enhances safety, and so. There's a narrative out there that I think is a little bit overstated, but the narrative that you do hear is that there's this threat of competition, and so we should regulate or overregulate or prohibit vending to protect the small businesses. And I think there's an opportunity to engage those brick and mortar businesses. The campaign has done a lot of outreach to engage businesses, to identify priorities, to think about ways to promote accessibility, to make sure that vendors aren't obstructing the access to those businesses, but to think about how they can interact and benefit each other. And I think that's when you're thinking about making policy or changing policy, it's those types of questions that you really need to think about. Like, who are the other stakeholders? What are their priorities? What are their concerns? And how do we create a system that, I don't want to say compromise, but a system that can address all of those various dynamics and concerns?
We're going to end with that. So I would like to thank our speakers. A round of applause, please. I also like to thank Dr. Gilbert Cadena from EWS, who co-sponsored this event and was very supportive of our efforts to support these type of educational events to help those that are suffering. For us as young people, well, I'm not young anymore, but for you as young people, to make a difference, not just for yourselves, but also when you get out there in the community and to put your education to good work. So thank you to everybody for showing up today. Take advantage of the food. It's free. If not, I'm going to take it home. And muchas gracias.